Hey guys, today we're gonna be going over, for BG's Essentials, we're gonna be talking about Masteries. This is first off, no, Masteries are one of, in my opinion, the thing you should decide last. You should tailor your Masteries to your deck rather than the other way around. But I wanted to make this video first, because I'm sure I'm gonna reference this a lot in defensive and attacking strats and all sorts of things. So I want this as just a reference point first and foremost. So with that being said, we're going to talk about every single mastery, at least that's relevant. We're going to talk about the strengths, the reasons to run, and I'm going to show off my mastery setup for BGs generally. Now starting off, the necessary masteries for offense: strength, of course, greater strength. You have to get these first 15 points to unlock anything, and you want cruelty and precision maxed. Now normally I would run a point in courage and 4 out of 5 in cruelty for my general setup, but in BGs, if you're dropping below 50% health, you're probably losing anyway, so it's better to just have cruelty maxed. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into the stuff that matters really. First of all, Glass Cannon. Now, Glass Cannon is, in my opinion, an absolutely awful mastery. Now, the reason it's so bad is because it does not affect modified attack. As you can see, it's only base attack, base health. And the reason this is such a big deal is the vast majority of BG's attackers have some form of modified attack. You know, you've got your Surfer with his Furies, you've got your Sunspot who gets the modified attack from his Flare Estate, you've got Nimrod with the modified attack from his Armors, you've got Stealthy with his Furies, Rintrah getting the modified attack, Starkey getting the modified attack, you've got Hulkling, Crossbones, whatever. The vast majority of champions have some form of modified attack, and when you have modified attack, Glass Cannon scales really, really poorly. But this is always going to decrease your defender's health by the same amount, when it's not always going to benefit you that much on attack. So it's just overall an awful mastery in my opinion, and not worth it. Absolutely not worth points when it's going to hurt you, rather than even, you know, a slight benefit for 3 points. Already kind of skeptical, but when it's going to hurt you, it's definitely not worth it. Just getting that out of the way, I don't think Glass Cannon is worthwhile at all. Now, onto the recoil tree and Liquid Courage and Double Edge. Now, the thing with recoil tree masteries and BGs is they're extremely unreliable, because you need such specific drafts to get a good Sui's draft going. You know, you might think in just a generic nuke meta that, you know, recoil would be really good because it helps you go quick, and that's important in BGs. But the important thing that for BGs that, of course, Sui's mess up with is when you're doing a nuke draft, you're generally relying on just using stall defenders to win. And just out-nuking your opponent with those stall defenders. And what Sui's drafts tend to force you into doing is trying to outdraft your opponent with good defenders, because you cannot really use the generic stalls and a lot of the best stalls with a Sui's deck. And this is a massive hit, because, you know, if you're doing a nuke deck, if you're facing someone that also has a good nuke deck, and they just have the good stalls, they're going to beat you in general. Like, certain times when you get a really, really good draft with Sui's, you're going to be unbeatable, especially with stuff like, Elsa and stuff like that. But that is definitely the exception and not the rule. In general, just someone with a really good nuke deck that has good stalls is going to be able to beat someone that's using a Sui's deck. Very few people at the top levels are running Sui's deck generally. There are a few people I know that make it work, but in general, it's a bad idea to run a Sui's deck. Yeah. With the exception of if there's a meta like Masochism or Crit Me with your best shot, where the defenders don't take as much Sui's damage, of course then you want to run Sui's, of course. Now, to quickly discuss some anti-recoil measures. This is important to keep in mind both for if you are running recoil yourself or if you're facing people who are running recoil. The first anti-recoil measure you can have is despair, which reduces the willpower healing and makes, people running suis take more damage from their suis, which can be the difference. And the second is inequity, which is going to give a weakness for those sui's debuffs, which means their attack bonus is going to be reduced by a lot. And the nice thing about inequity is this, unlike glass cannon, affects modified attack, which is really, really powerful. We will get into that more later, but just keep in mind that despair and inequity can be really good anti-sui's measures. And yeah, that is all for discussing sui's. I wanted to get that out of the way. It's one of the more nuanced topics with Masteries. Now, next up, for continuing with this, the first thing I want to talk about, despair. Of course, this is anti-recoil, as I just mentioned, and despair tends to be kind of a more niche one, but in its niche, it is very decisive. Some of the defenders that you generally want despair against are Mephi, Sassy, and Infamous Iron Man for their regens, each of them. Despair helps a lot. That's self-explanatory. Now, one of the things that maybe a bit less self-explanatory is when you're fighting, when you're placing someone like Null or Havoc or Terex that gives a lot of these debuffs. If you have Despair Max, they're not going to be getting that willpower healing, which helps a whole lot, because if they are getting that full willpower healing, then they're going to be ending those fights at 100% every time. Just maxing Despair to cancel that out does a lot. And yeah, that is a pretty important part. If you're placing Null, Havoc, Terex regularly, Despair is very important for that. And the final thing with Despair is if you're using heal reversals on attack, this includes like Mr. Fantastic, Mr. Negative, Void even, then you're going to want Despair to reverse healing, of course. This works really well because of willpower healing in Battlegrounds. Willpower means you can reverse that willpower healing, get a lot of damage with that, which can be very strong occasionally. Not the most common thing when you're using willpower reversal, but it does happen and it can be very powerful. Now, next up with Deep Wounds, this is really going to be a deck-dependent one, but when it's useful, Deep Wounds is fantastic. Just a quick rundown of the champs that you generally are going to get a lot of benefit from Deep Wounds with. You've got OG Black Panther, you've got Blade, you've got Hitmonkey, Nick Fury, Moleman, Killmonger, Jabari, Domino, Archangel, Joe Fixit, Medusa, Warlock, and Weapon X. All of these on attack, of course. It makes a really big difference for all of them. And a lot of those ones I just quickly listed off are some of the best Battlegrounds attackers. This is fairly self-explanatory for if you should run it or not. Not everybody should run Deep Wounds, but if you do have a deck where it's beneficial, it is extremely powerful. And now let's get on to the final two masteries I want to talk about in this attack tree. Assassin. In my opinion, Assassin in general is awful for BGs. There is merit to putting a single point into Assassins, and this means when you're fighting Hark, sometimes you'll turn off his immortality and get a quicker fight. And there's a good amount of merit to that, I think. Just turning off that immortality occasionally can be worth a single point if you have a point to spare. And then for Unfazed is really good at catching people off guard on defense. If your defenders are getting taken by like Elsa, Stark Spidey, or Mr. Negative a lot, Unfazed can be very valuable there. Again, I would not put more than 1 point in it. I would not put more than 1 point in this. I think it's a bit of a waste to do more than 1 point, since 1 point is definitely enough to catch people off guard when it happens. And even when it does happen, you can still work around it. It's mostly just about catching people off guard. Worth the point, depending on your situation, can definitely be worth the point. For me, I have 1 extra point to move around, so it's basically 1 point in Unfazed, 1 point in Assassins, or 1 point in Stand Your Ground, so I just picked between those 3 for my setup and went on Stand Your Ground since I don't ban Tigra. But there's definitely merit to moving that point to something like Unfazed or Assassins, just not for me personally. More worried about Tigra than the other options in there, and I banned Herc, so I wouldn't do the Assassins one. And yeah, that's it for the offense tree. I think in general this is a pretty good standard offense setup. I would guess a lot of people run something pretty close to this. Now for defensive tree, starting off, you're going to see this 9 out of 9 greater vitality. This is a little bit shocking, I'd imagine. Not many people run this in general, and, you know, in general, it's not great. But for defense, this is very, very valuable. 8% extra attack. 8% extra health can be very decisive. And it's pretty self-explanatory, so I won't get too deep into it, but it's very valuable. The next matchup, the next mastery here in defense tree, recovery. This has two main values. One, if you're fighting against someone with Despair Max and they're using Null, Havoc, Terrax like that, they cannot completely stop your healing. This lets you still get 15% of that willpower healing, which can be decisive, especially against someone like Null. Personally, I don't think it's the biggest deal, but if you have the extra points to spare, it can be worthwhile. Block proficiency, this is a must. It's just such a massive difference. You need this maxed. And then you have to put 1 more point to get to 15, so I put it in perfect block for the occasional perfect block. And then I have my free point that I mentioned earlier in Stand Your Ground. I don't think Stand Your Ground is worth having more than 1 point for in BGs instead of something like Greater Vitality. I do think the 1 point is worthwhile to catch the occasional person off guard with it. But BGs is more about just being generally reliably solid than, you know, the very rare chance for something like Stand Your Ground or Unfazed to change a fight like it could in Alliance War. It's not generally going to make or break a round in Battlegrounds. And yeah, that's the defense tree basics. Now to get on to the more interesting ones. First of all, Collar Tech. Now Collar Tech is a surprisingly really good mastery. Maxed out for the tech class, this is an extremely powerful mastery, especially for Doc Ock and Ghost specifically, with their sort of pseudo power control that Ghost has, and the just outright power control Doc Ock has. It's very powerful on those two. It's also really, really good on Warlock and Stark Spidey and Nimrod, and yeah. If you're using these champions regularly, there's a lot of merit to putting points in Collar Tech. And yeah, it's kind of like Deep Lens, where it's not for every deck. It's not going to be good for every deck. For a lot of decks, it's going to make little to no difference, but when the right deck is there, it can be extremely worthwhile. The one thing I will note is if you are running Guardian a lot, Collar Tech can hurt you from giving the opponent less power, since you oftentimes want to give the opponent more power with Guardian. And that's the one downside I will note of this. If you're on Guardian, might not be worth it. But yeah, Stark Spidey, Nimrod, Warlock, Doc Ock, Ghost get a lot of benefit from this. There's a lot of merit to running Collar Tech for BGs. I think it has a lot of value. Just is very roster dependent. Now on to Willpower. Now Willpower is one that has both a lot of merit and a lot of disadvantages. As I mentioned earlier, with reversing willpower healing, champions like Reed, Mr. Negative, and Void get a lot of benefit from that on attack, and Warlock also, of course, does this. Along with the newly buffed Rocket, he's going to take advantage of this a lot. So you're going to have a bunch of champions that can take advantage of this, and it could make your defense weaker. But I think overall it's worth it because of all the situations. It's going to give you a lot of extra health on attack. If you're fighting Nimrod, Overseer, I-Bomb, anyone like that just gives some debuffs on you, this can be extremely valuable, along with if you're running Kingpin or I-Bomb or someone like that. The regen healing is just so much. much, and you know, getting those full yellow bar fights in BGs helps a lot for getting those extra points. And yeah, it's pretty massive in situations where it helps. It's not gonna help all the time, but it does have its disadvantages for sure, but I think it's worth running a point in. And yeah. If you are only running 1 point, the willpower reversal won't be as effective, so there's some merit to running 1 instead of 3 points as well. Yeah. Oh, and one more thing to note with recovery, forgot to mention this, this will reduce the amount of power that you can reverse by, because despair cannot go past 100%, so this will keep your general regen rate at 115%, and then despair will take it down to 15%, so this will take up 15% of the petrify, and give them a little bit less regen reversal as well from recovery if you want to max recovery. Now, let's get on to what is kind of the deciding factor in my BG's deck. Inequity is so powerful. This is the most underrated mastery in the game. First off, I mentioned the anti-recoil already in the recoil section. So I won't go on that too much, but it's fairly self-explanatory. The one thing that it does extremely well is if your opponent wants to use I-Bomb or Kingpin on attack, this is going to hurt them a lot, because of those debuffs they put on themselves. Fairly self-explanatory, but it makes a huge difference, and basically means you don't have to worry about I-Bomb or Kingpin on attack. Now, I-Bomb can still put up decent speeds, not amazing speeds, but decent speeds. He is slowed down by it, generally by about 15 to 20 seconds due to how his ramp up goes. It's not by quite as much as Kingpin, who generally has consistent damage throughout the fight. But since this affects modified attack, it affects Kingpin in a huge way, because it's just a flat 30% reduction. And to get on to the math of why this 30% reduction in attack is so massive, this basically means a 50% increase in fight duration if Inequity is running at full capacity. Because whereas a 36% weakness, you're like, how is that a 50% increase in fight duration? For example, just to illustrate the math for this, if you have 100 hit points and a combo does 10 attacks, and a combo does 10 hit points, if you have a 36% weakness and your combo does 6.4 damage, then it's going to take 15.2 combos to get down that 100 hit points instead of just 10 combos like it normally would, and that's 50% extra fight duration. Along with, a lot of the times this means abilities that happen later in a fight, for example, someone like Mangog, someone like Sassy, someone like Havoc. That weakness can be particularly dangerous against, and Havoc is the big one I want to talk about with this. Havoc with Inequity is a ridiculously strong defender, because the slow fight for him means so much more than just the extra fight duration, since generally one of the main strats for Havoc is to just nuke him down before a plasma detonation happens. But if the fight is going so much slower, then that plasma detonation is going to happen, and you're going to get that slower fight, of course. And this makes Havoc one of the best defenders in the game. It's genuinely ridiculous how strong he is with Inequity. I've been running him so much as a defender. He really is ridiculous with Inequity. For some other defenders that it just generally benefits quite well, Null and Terrax are ridiculous with it. And then I-Bomb, Man-Thing, Dragon, and Reed get a good chunk of benefit as well. Now, for attack, using Inequity on attack, because it does have some merit on attack, if you are fighting Mephi or I-Bomb and champs like that will generally be doing damage to you, it will reduce the damage you take, of course. This is really good against I-Bomb specifically, because of the debuffs he places on himself, and this means you can use a lot of just nuke options for I-Bomb, and due to the weakness, you're not taking quite as much poison damage, and it's very workable. This is let me, just do, like, stealthy versus I-Bomb and get away with that, and the normal counters like Archangel is a little bit less RNG reliant with this, and Hitmonkey is almost always going to end with a full yellow bar with an equity. And then Maffy, you know, he doesn't place the debuff on himself, but if you're using a debuff heavy counter to Maffy and you have an equity, you're going to take less aura damage, and fighting those two in specific, an equity on attack helps quite a lot, and it's very, very nice there. And that is all I wanted to talk about for defense tree. Coagulate, Suture, and Resonate, they have their merit, but I really do not think they're ever going to be worth points in your BG stack. You know, there's merit to them, I just really don't think they're worthwhile for a BG stack. And on to proficiencies. For proficiencies, of course, maxed out parry. This gives extra stun duration, which is massive. Maxed out stupefy, extra stun duration is massive. Point in dex, and you have to have a point in limber. And then you can either put 4 points into limber to help your defenders out a little bit, to unlock Mystic Dispersion, or you can put 3 points into Petrify. And what Petrify does is it lets you just nuke a bunch of shit with that less power gain they're going to get. This is especially valuable if you're using Torch or Omega or Hitmonkey or Archangel or all of these champs where a large amount of their hits are concentrated within the stuns. And the difference in power gain it makes is really massive. Similar to Collar Tech, it's ridiculous. Sunspot and Shang-Chi and CGR are more good examples of this, but it really can be super powerful, and I strongly recommend Petrify for BGs over the points in Limber if you're going to be running Mystic Dispersion. It really just makes such a massive difference. I love Petrify. It's a massive benefit to any champs who are going to be hitting mostly within the stun. And yeah, it's really fantastic. I think it kind of speaks for itself with a 30% power reduction during the stuns. It's amazing. I can't do it justice with a word. It really is amazing. It helps me nuke a bunch of stuff where power is an issue. And yeah, it's fantastic. And of course, Mystic Dispersion 5, the ubiquitous, any Mystics basically rely on Mystic Dispersion. For me, I have Man-Thing, Tigra, Rintrah, and Doom in my deck. Tiger and Rintrah don't really care about Mystic Dispersion, but Man-Thing and Doom alone is enough to make Mystic Dispersion worth running, because when it makes a difference, the difference is so massive. And yeah, I mean, it's a ridiculously strong mastery when it works. I think everybody knows Mystic Dispersion at this point, so I won't go too deep into that, but yeah. Anyway, that is the end for my mini mastery guide for BGs. In general, I think in general, it really depends on your deck for what you should run, but as a general rule of thumb, I think Mystic Dispersion, Petrify, and Inequity are going to be really strong almost no matter what you're running. Inequity is a little bit reliant on specific defenders, but in those specific defenders, it's just so strong, and I really think, you know, maxing Greater Vitality and Petrify instead of the normal substitutes that you would run to get to Willpower and Mystic Dispersion can make a pretty huge difference. And do not go into Glass Cannon. Yeah, Despair and Deep Wounds and Collar Tech are fantastic masteries, but they are definitely deck dependent. I would recommend most people running Despair, but definitely not everyone, and Deep Wounds and all of that is just deck dependent. I think overall, if you have the just general good masteries down for BGs, it really is going to be just dependent on what you've got in your deck for where you should put the rest of your points. Hopefully this can give you a good understanding of, you know, the value of putting certain points in certain places. And yeah, that's all for the first episode of this BG's Fundamentals series. I hope to get more out, hopefully this week. If I end up having the time, I would like to try and get most of these videos up before the war season starts. And yeah, take care, guys.